I'm Michelle, and my pronouns are she, her. My presentation today is how to host a podcast for 25 cents a month. I host the podcast from the source. I interview people working in tech about the good, the bad, and the boring. It's a way for me to feature underrepresented voices in tech while getting to speak to amazing people for an hour. Today, I'm going to talk about the podcast, but more importantly, how you can start your own. The focus will be on how I use AWS and Python to self-host, but I am happy to take any questions you have about podcasting in the Q&A. Before we dive into the tech, let's talk about why you should have a podcast. First of all, no one can stop you. There's a freedom to knowing you can say whatever you want and be in the same catalog as Reply All or Planet Money. You can create fictional plays or talk about your day. There's no producer to tell you no. Some of my favorite shows are niche, like Burn Noticed, where they built an entire podcast on watching a 10-year-old USA show. It's all about having fun and being passionate about your content. The only caveat to the no one can tell you no is that most podcast players use the Apple Podcast catalog, and they do have an approval process. However, it's focused on mislabeled explicit content and not nearly as much gatekeeping as their apps. Second, it's fun to learn new skills. It's also aggravating, but eventually worth it. Audio editing, marketing, and how to conduct an interesting interview were all skills I didn't have before I started my podcast. I'm still trying to figure them out, but seeing myself slowly get better is exhilarating. It also helps in other areas. Being able to ask insightful questions and draw people out makes me a better networker and a better friend. Learning to put myself out there for the podcast helps me market myself and get better opportunities. If I just walked up to someone and said, "You're so interesting. Will you talk to me for an hour while I ask you personal questions about your career?" they would back away slowly. Instead, I say, "You're so interesting. Would you like to be a featured guest on my podcast?" And some of the time, they say yes. For some reason, when I tell people I host a podcast, they are often delighted and impressed. I didn't expect it, but it's a fun perk. It enhances your brand and is a great icebreaker. Another reason to start your podcast is that you get a whole new community. If there's anything I learned about 2020, it is that I can never have enough people to talk to. I'm in the tech community, so mostly I talk to other people in tech. While I love all of you, it's good to meet people with different experiences. They might live 2,000 miles away and work in insurance, but you can commiserate on how bad you are at social media marketing. Finally, making money from podcasting. This is a trick. You will almost definitely lose money. You need a large audience as well as polished and consistent content to make any money in podcasts. If you're doing this as a side project, you probably won't have time to make that happen. But I'm here to make sure you lose as little as money as possible while still being worth it. Now that I've convinced you to start your own podcast, you're going to need to create a few things. First, you need the recording. I record using Zencastr, which is a cloud service useful for interviews. I edit with GarageBand because it came free on my MacBook. There are lots of other options out there, but I haven't explored them too much because these are working for me. Second, you need artwork. It is better to have different artwork for every episode, but I started with one logo and used it for everything. You need a JPEG with a resolution of 1400 by 1400. This is the Apple Podcast standard. Third, you need an XML file with all of the information about your podcast. This is your RSS feed, which allows aggregators to put your show in their catalog. It has information like title, description, and episode name. I will make a template available, but the place to get the latest formatting is Apple Podcasts. You might be noticing a trend here where I use Apple Podcasts as my North Star. I do that because while there are 100 podcast apps, almost all of them reference Apple Podcasts. There are a few major exceptions like Spotify, and once you're ready to have your podcast aggregated, You will want to register them with as many places as possible. There are two ways to get your podcast on your friends' phones. You can use one of the many managed services. I'm not going to offer opinions on those because I don't use them. You can think of them like any software service. Either they will cost you a monthly fee, or you pay with ads or with your data. Since I knew that the more money this cost me, the less chance I would stick with it, I want to see if I can manage the hosting myself. There are two steps to self hosting. One is making the audio and artwork available to the internet, and two is creating a document for aggregators to know about your podcast. I've pre-prepped sample files for this presentation, and by the end of the talk, you'll be able to listen to my brand new podcast. Now, I'm going to switch from these slides to the live demo. I'm starting at the Amazon Web Services homepage, otherwise known as AWS. If you are completely unfamiliar with it, that's okay. I'll be explaining as I go. AWS has a service called S3. S3 is a storage service for files hosted by AWS. It is similar to Google Drive, iCloud, or Dropbox. You upload files and then decide who can view them. The difference between those services and S3 is that S3 is focused on engineers and large-scale projects. It's used to make money hosting massive sites like Amazon itself, so the cost for your tiny MP3 is much smaller. It also connects to many other AWS services. If you do not have an AWS account, you'll want to set that up. It asks you for a credit card, which can be scary, but if you're careful, you shouldn't have a big bill. For small projects, you'll generally stay in the free tier. To prevent any surprises, the first thing you'll want to do after you create an account is to set up a budget to alert you to any changes. I have mine warn me if I reach $2.50 a month. A link on how to do that is in the written version of this tutorial. Another caveat to AWS is that they are changing things all the time. I originally took screenshots of this process a few months ago for the blog post. Since then, the interface and order of operations has already changed. Sadly, AWS does not send me alerts when they make changes that affect my free tutorials of their products. I wanted to point this out, not to dissuade or scare you, but just so you're careful when doing anything on AWS. Make sure to read through carefully and not just follow a tutorial, even mine. I'm now logging in to get to S3. Once there, I'm going to create two S3 buckets. Buckets are similar to directories or folders to hold your files. One will be public for the audio, podcast, art, and XML feed. The other one is to store your logs so you can track your audience. You don't get a lot of info, but it's nice to see how many downloads you're getting. First, I select the big orange Create Bucket button on the top right. This takes us to the form where I make the bucket. I am naming this especially for the conference, so you know I am making a podcast just for you. The only setting I am changing here is to make the bucket public. Having a bucket be open to the public when it's supposed to be private is a major security issue for many companies. So AWS wants to double check that you know what you're doing. When I'm making the logs bucket, I leave it private. Once they are both created, I need to actually set up the login. I've selected the new bucket and then the Properties tab. I scroll down to Server Access Logging. This is the simplest logging you can set up for your bucket. It is currently disabled, so I'm setting it to Enabled. I am then copying in the name for the logs bucket I already made. The next step is to make subfolders for the assets before I can upload them. I am back in the public bucket itself. The Create Folder button is right next to the Upload button. First, I create the RSS folder. That is where the XML file goes. Then I make the audio directory where the actual podcast audio goes. And finally, I make the images directory for all the podcast artwork. You can see the three folders I just made. Now I can upload the image and audio that I prepared. I go into the subfolder for audio and select the audio. Then I do the same thing for the image. Before I can upload the XML file, I need to edit it. It needs to point to those files that I am currently uploading. I need to select the file to see the object location. There are a few different ways you can filter an object in S3. The ARN and the S3 path are mostly used for internal settings. The HTTP path is what is needed. That is how our listeners access our files. I'm going to select one of the files I uploaded so I can see the whole path. Now that we have the location, it's time to edit the XML file. I have opened it in a text editor so you can see it. It can look daunting, but all I need to do is fill in the fields. At the top is a bunch of boilerplate for different RSS feeds. Most of this does not need to change because I already filled it in, like the name and description of the podcast, the audio length, etc. What does need to change is the location of the files I uploaded, which I'm adding now. I've already uploaded the XML file the same way I did the audio and image file. There's one last thing before I validate the podcast, which is making sure everything in the bucket is public. While I made the bucket public, that does not automatically make all the uploaded assets public. So I select all the folders, then Action, and finally Make Public. This will make sure everything is accessible. I am now ready to test the XML file. I grabbed the object URL from AWS. I'm using a third-party website to validate the field. You can see it checking that everything went well, and I can even listen to the audio. Welcome to From the Source. I'm Michelle Brenner, and I'm your host. Now, what would a Python presentation be without some Python? Before I let you test out the brand new podcast, I want to talk about the open source project. This is a repo where I keep scripts I've written to make podcasts easier to create. One is the editor that breaks up large audio files into pieces based on silence. I found that when I was editing podcasts, that was the first thing I would do. And then I remembered I was an engineer and wrote a Python script for it. It makes it way easier to edit and remove all the filler words like things like that. My goal for this repo is to keep adding Python tools to the podcast, from automating the demo I just showed you to refreshing ads. On this final slide, I've shared a few different URLs. The first is a short URL I made from the larger XML object URL. I'd like you to take a minute and see if you can add it to your podcast app on your phone. There should be some sort of feature to add a private RSS feed. Technically, the link is public, but it's not searchable yet because I haven't told Apple or Spotify it exists. There are also links to my Dev.to blog, where I have a written version of this tutorial, and a link to the open source project I mentioned. Finally, if you're not sick of hearing me talk, you can hear my real podcast From the Source. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to any questions you may have.